Hello, my colleagues. I'm so happy to see you. Welcome. So here we are, sitting down with our hot cup of tea, of course, and talking tarot. In continuing the study of the tarot, I'm continuing actually to look at the groupings that were given by Kim Huggins in her book called Tarot 101. I found that the groupings were really quite interesting because I didn't really want to present the major arcana and just go straight through in the order of numbers. I wanted to sort of group them into the ways that make sense to me. Of course, you can group the tarot cards in many different ways, but for the purposes of these videos, I've decided to group the major arcana much in the way that Kim Huggins has in her book. So here we are. This grouping here, as you see, is called the dark side. These are the cards that, because of the pictures that they show, can really make people who don't know a lot about tarot, they can elicit some fear. They can make people feel very afraid and maybe give an impression about the tarot that is not entirely very welcoming. Here we see the Hanged Man, we see the Devil, and the Tower. They can look like very scary concepts when you see somebody hanging. Of course, this hanging is not in the traditional sense, when we think about sort of capital punishment, historically speaking, I guess. The devil, of course, is an abstract concept that basically shows a characterization of what motivates behavior that is not very adaptive to social constructs. And, of course, the tower, you see people falling down to their deaths from heights. So these can look like very scary images. However, you'll see in this talk that the images, although very scary, can show times in our lives that really invite you to reflect upon, where you are at this point in your life. The major arcana, of course, are the major milestones in your life. So let's take a look at what the tarot can give us and see if we might be able to look at these images as a means of spiritual development, certainly psycho-spiritual development. So the first image is the Hanged Man. And this is an image where the tarot is using this picture to symbolically illustrate you letting go of the control that you thought you had over the issues in your life. It is also asking you to have a letting go, such as an emotional release, to accept the things that may be changing. This person certainly looks very vulnerable in this position, although he does seem to be quite in control. He doesn't have an expression on his face that shows discontent or alarm. He's in a very meditative pose. The look on his face is rather serene. And the picture of suspension upside down is showing that your thoughts and your process is in suspension. This is a time in your life where you are going to pause to look at things from a different perspective. And you see here by the radiating light around his head that he is deep in thought, and he's having glorious radiating sort of state of consciousness there. So that is what this card is telling you, is to take a moment to pause, to look at things from a different perspective, perhaps plan on how you can make things turn around for you 180 degrees, as this person has. Some people will make the mistake of saying that when you turn things around in your life, you come a full 360. But if you come a full 360, 360 degrees in a circle, would imply that you're right back where you started. So indeed, if you are taking the exact opposite direction, you are going 180 degrees in the opposite direction. Now, this card, of course, I don't necessarily think that 180 degrees is always the way to make things work if you're in a stagnant position and you can't make things go forward in your life. Sometimes you have to go, a little bit in a different direction, not necessarily the exact opposite direction. So this card, like I said, is a card of letting go. It is asking you to reverse the way that you think or to take an alternative perspective. The other thing is that the action is suspension. This man is not actually in movement. He's not racing. You don't really see him riding a horse or doing any kind of action at all. He's very still. The action, if there is any, is all happening around in his thoughts. So this is a time where action itself is suspended, but there's a lot of work being done cognitively. This is also probably not a very comfortable position, to say the least. So that is illustrating the sacrifice that you may have to endure to turn things around in your life. Sometimes you have to, make a plan and think about what you want to do, pause to do so. But when you want to put the plan into action, you actually have to give up a few things or work to get to your goal. So those are the four main key points that I've seen that, in common in a lot of references that I've consulted. The suffering may lead to a better understanding. So if you are going to suffer at all in this uncomfortable position, it may lead to a better understanding. This is the experience where your mind, your body, your soul are tormented by perhaps some doubt or some illusion. And through this, somehow you aim to evolve, to work through it, and to come out with a more loving perspective, a more enlightened perspective. You may also say that this is what they call the dark night of the soul. So you're taking that time, of course, to surrender that which you thought you knew and to somehow become transformed by this very pensive experience. It's a topsy-turvy time. It's a time to be upside down, and through that, perhaps even looking at what things may look like from a different person's perspective in this experience that you are living. When you come to the tarot, you have a question, you have a query, and you are asking about a certain situation to gain some enlightenment. And when you see this card, it's prompting you to look at that situation in your life from a different perspective, an upside-down perspective. Just maybe you want to look at it from the other person's perspective if there's somebody else in the situation that you are dealing with at home or in your life, in your workplace. Let's see. This card also asks you to rise above the situation that you are in and to ask yourself how you are going to go about doing that. You are going to reevaluate where you are. It's a time for discernment when you see the hangman. You may be at a point in life where things are not working as well as you would have expected. So you find that there's a bit of stagnation. And again, that is illustrated by his physical sort of pose of, not being in movement. So you are reframing your point of view. You are redefining how you want to achieve your goals. And perhaps even pausing to wait for the opportune time to take action. There are shadow aspects. We certainly, at this point in time, talk a lot about shadow work, which is a very Jungian perspective, Jung being Carl Jung. So he talks about the shadow aspects of your personality and how you can use those darker moments in your life, those things that we don't want to share with other people, those things that we're ashamed of admitting to ourselves, and embracing them, looking at them as a point of learning, looking at them and evolving from them, so that you can, when you evolve from that shadow aspect, you become a better person, having learned something from the difficulty that you've been through. So it would be, even more poignant to look at the shadow aspect with this card, and indeed with all of these darker aspect cards. So the shadow aspect of this card would include the inability to think of change, the unwillingness to work forward and to implement the change for whatever reasons. Pardon me. It's sort of a time where you would be reluctant to learn from mistakes, or even to admit that you are having mistakes. So that would be a shadow aspect that comes with this card. It may even be because of the sort of the aspect of sacrificing the self with this card. The shadow aspect would include sacrificing too much of yourself, where you let a bit of yourself go and you're not true to yourself. Perhaps you are coming face to face with someone who is a bit narcissistic and who's demanding too much for you, and and you acquiesce and you're untrue to yourself, letting yourself being sort of influenced by other people who may not have your best interests at heart. So that is that's just sort of an overview of the Hanged Man, and that is one of the 3 cards which Kim Huggins will call the dark side. So let's look now at the Devil. This is the middle card. Now, I recognize the Devil as a human construct. Other people may have a different understanding of what the Devil may be, but for me, it is a purely human invention. Humans are the ones who write about it, and it sort of is an aspect of ourselves that takes human form. We draw a caricature that may or may not look something like the one here shown on this card. So the Devil card, when you're looking at that, you may be experiencing bondage at this point in your life when this turns up in a reading. Bondage meaning that it's an unwanted situation where you feel tied and you're being held against your will. Somehow you don't feel that you have the control that you would like to have. It may be a position of being addicted to something. You're feeling somehow that you are submitting and you are being made to feel lesser than your full self or your best self. Now here you see the chains are very loosely. I mean, there are chains. These are the stage, like the position of bondage that I'm talking about. But they're very loosely tied. And these people, these male and female figures, could easily take that chain and pull it over their head and walk away. So somehow, because they're tied there so loosely and standing there, what looks like they have a willingness to stand there and stay there, it's the control comes from within. The control is not sort of a person or a being that is holding you really against your will. Somehow there's been a manipulation of the soul, a manipulation of the mind, a manipulation of the self, And you've been conditioned to accept things so that you are following this route. And you know better. But still somehow you feel trapped. You feel like a position of bondage. Why it is that I start coughing when I'm chatting, I don't know. But I'm going to do my best to try and not cough. At any rate, this here, you see the pentagram here that's shown on top of the devil's head. Now that is also a symbol that comes up quite often. Now when this star shows up and the point is on the top, that is showing spirit, which is the fifth element, and the other four elements being air, fire, water, and earth, which are below that point. With the spirit, or God, the sort of the almighty entity, being above all material goods. This star, this pentagram, is inverted. And when you see the inverted pentagram, then the point, or the spirit, is below all material goods, all elements. So that is showing you that materialism comes before any kind of spiritual development, which is something that we tend to associate, that sort of conditioning of the mind. We associate that with a devil sort of a behavior. So here in this card, you may be focusing on the material. That's what you would, sort of read for yourself or tell a client when this card shows up in a reading. It's also a position where you are staying unaware. You are ignorant. Your knowledge is kept very narrow. You may be deceived by appearances. There is a willingness to stay in the dark, basically. The other thing that you will associate with this card is a feeling of hopelessness or helplessness, that you are feeling despair and sort of like a negative mindset where your future doesn't look as bright. It's a very dark sort of colors surround the card. So it's certainly not a place of happiness. This may be a place where you are feeling some obsessions that take over your better judgment. This is a card that talks to you about shame and why. You may ask yourself, are you feeling shame about the situation that you are contemplating when you're doing a reading for yourself or for others? What is that shame coming from? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from the influence of other people? Is it coming from the words of other people? Someone else who may not be a very good influence on you? Is it coming from something that you may have done and that you regret? So this is a card that when it pulls up, you may want to look at why you are feeling some regret or some shame. Let's see. This card also talks about temptation, given that it's a devil aspect in the card. The devil, will encompass temptation, fear, feeling trapped. You may also want to, I don't want to say succumb to desires, but you may indulge in desires, and it may cause for you to have an imbalance. And I don't want to say succumb because we really do choose our behaviors. I don't know that it's terribly helpful to look at the devil as an entity other than yourself, but to recognize it as behaviors that we all do. Christians typically will call it sinning or being a sinner. I think it's a very psychologically reasonable assumption that we all have behaviors that are maladaptive. So I wouldn't really call it sinning. I would call it a maladaptive behavior that you learn from. So when something does not bring about and you suffer because it did not bring about what you thought it would, then you don't do that behavior anymore. And so we have a list of behaviors which we would call sins because they bring about, shame and harm and pain and suffering, either to yourself or to other people. So I would call that more of a maladaptive behavior, really. And so that is what I tend to see when I look at a devil card, is a group of behaviors that, you're going to do somewhere in your human experience, because that's how we learn. And it's not necessarily that you're being influenced by some very powerful entity other than yourself. You're making mistakes, just like a rat, like a rat in a maze, taking wrong turns, and then you have to double back and sort of, fix where you're going to get to, to leave the maze, sort of see, or to get that piece of cheese, or whatever the analogy might include. This also, in these behaviors, these maladaptive behaviors, may include lust and greed and hatred, feeling lost, self-harm, immaturity, anger. And of course, feeling anger doesn't really look very maladaptive at all. You can't really see anger so much until it shows up in a behavior, like reddening the face or hitting somebody if it's an outwardly expressed anger. So you see how these things really have to manifest as a behavior before they become harmful to someone else. This card also invites you to look past all of that, because knowing that we all go through the human experience of making mistakes and doing these maladaptive behaviors, we have to learn from them. And once you have learned from them, you sort of transcend that. It's called maturity. You've kind of graduated that program and you've learned that lesson. So that's what you call maturity and experience. You notice that a lot more people will go to prison for having done maladaptive things and crimes, sort of maladaptive behavior. They tend to go to prison at a very younger age, because that's when you're still learning, than going to prison at a very old age. So it's more frequently we'll see people going at a young age, because that's when you're still making your mistakes. Older people tend to have made their mistakes at a younger age, and thankfully, most people don't make them to the level that they have to be imprisoned, because most people learn a lot quicker to behave themselves, and to comply with sort of what is good for everyone in society. So I don't think you can really talk about the devil card without talking about society and your rights and your responsibilities, because you can't talk about rights without talking about your responsibilities to others. Okay, so that is the dark side 4, as shown by the devil card. Now, the tower. Just trying to fix my throat a little bit. The tower is an interesting card. Here we see just a whole lot of things happening here. We have the lightning. We have bits of fire coming down. We have the top of the tower, which can also look like a crown, and it's popping off because the lightning is hitting the tower. You have fire. You have people just jumping down, plunging to their death, head first, into what may be water, what may be very rough sort of cliffs down below. And a whole lot of manifestation with these clouds, a whole lot of chaos. And of course there's the black background, which looks very bleak. So again, not another happy card. That's why this trio is called the dark side. So the tower, going through a sudden change, is what you're going to talk about when this card comes up. Sudden, because it doesn't look like there has been a whole lot of planning. I mean, these people are not sort of walking down the stairs with bags packed and a whole lot of preparation, walking, sauntering down a long path after, after having planned anything at all. This is very sudden. This is emerging from from the tower in a way that you wouldn't have expected in the first place. So it's an upheaval. Things are being shaken up. You're surprised. And somewhere in this chaos, there's a chance to release. So that is a time to let go. You are leaving what you knew, and mind you, you're doing it sort of against your will. But along with the explosion comes, it's the breaking apart of your ego's defenses. It's breaking through the pretenses that you were holding up, your ego, your masks that you would have had. So that is what this card is talking about. It's an emotional experience of breaking free in a very, albeit violent way. So these people were at the height. They were at a point of success, at the height of a tower, and they're falling down suddenly. And when you're reading this card, you're going to implement that aspect in the reading, because where you were, you're going to a very, very deep place. That's very different, and it's unexpected. Somehow in there will be a realizing of the truth. The lightning is coming from the heavens, so it's a burst of insight. It's not a fire coming from the bellows from down below. It's not, they're not getting flooded. It is a lightning burst coming from up above. And so it's an insight. It's a moment of clarity in a very big way. It brings you down to the lowest part of the tower, to the lowest point where you can possibly be from where you were. From this point, you may think that there's no getting out. But, of course, as in any situation, there always is. All of these cards, every single card that I have seen in the tarot, every single card talks about perception. And that's why I'm just going to take a moment to talk about tarot in general. I look at it as a psycho-spiritual process to read the tarot to yourself and then to share that skill with other people, because it's a time to reflect on your life and ask yourself questions. These cards are images, but they prompt you to ask the questions that are illustrated on the card. These themes are not necessarily, I know that in history they were used as a game and used with their predictive value. But, because these cards depict just every possible aspect of the human life, anything that we can experience, the illustrations in the cards really, I think, challenge your perceptions. Like, for instance, going back to the Hanged Man. Your perception was one way, and it's asking you to look at things from a different way. The devil is basically looking at you to be accountable for what you're doing, because basically everything that is maladaptive is your own behavior. Take off the shackles, pull up your socks, although these people don't have any, and be accountable for your behavior and learn from your mistakes and move on. And again, here, you may think that you are falling from the tower to the depths of despair, for instance, to the lowest point where you think you can't come up, but there always is a way, either a way to climb back up or to walk away or to swim away. There's always a way to rise above from the ashes. And these are the messages that I think are very useful in absolutely all of the 78 tarot cards. So although the images are, I don't know if I want to say antiquated, they're very time-honored. There's time-honored symbolism, and I'm only touching the surface. There's plenty of other symbolism that is available in these cards that I haven't even touched yet, such as the horns on the devil, and the number 4 that is depicted here in suspension, and the way that his hands are tied, and the T here. There's just a ton. There's a ton of illustrations in every card that I sort of skim over, and I just pick and choose to show you in this series. But really, everything is about perception, and it's all about personal development. So there's a wealth of information, even though the cards are made like over 100 years ago now. And, there's a lot of talk about how all of the people are able-bodied, Caucasian, kind of good-looking, all the same size, all the same, there's a few of them that are different sizes, but generally, I'm thinking about the 10 of Cups. Generally, these people don't sort of show the full breadth, the full wide spectrum of how people look on the entire planet. But nonetheless, if you look at these people, as figures, as souls, as humans, walking around and living the human experience, I think there's much to be gleaned and much to be learned from the images that come from them. So let me just continue here. That was an interesting little aside about the tarot in general. I'll continue now with the Tower. You may think that with the Tower, this is pointless destruction. It's very pointless. What is the point of everything that has happened? I worked so hard to get to the height of success. This lightning bolt happened. This thing happened at work. Management, the insight that came from above may be, an act from management that totally destroyed my project, and now I'm falling down. That could be a way to sort of interpret what's happening. You may have perhaps interpreted this question or this situation as being a home-like situation where you are quite happy, and yet from above, perhaps a parent or a neighbor or a landlord has had some sort of action, and now you can no longer live in that home, and so now you're homeless, or you're having to move, and you don't know how you're going to get through that because it's just bringing so much stress that you're at the end of your tether. This sort of situation can apply to many things in your daily life, and so it's asking you to kind of take a look at that and ask yourself how you're going to pull yourself out from there and what you've learned from this experience. So you see here there's fire. Fire can be seen as a destructive element, but it's also an element that produces rejuvenation afterwards. After the field has been, taken by fire, and you see trees that have been completely destroyed, you will, the following spring, see new life emerge from that. And so there's a very creative sort of aspect to the fire that's there as well. Although in this position, it's talking definitely about the destruction of whatever it is that they were working on. What else can I tell you? You might, to adapt after this situation, you may want to reorganize. Now that you've learned something from this situation, you need to reorganize and reprioritize, shuffle things around so that this sort of event doesn't happen again. This may also depict a spiritual crisis in your life. That can possibly be the enlightenment from above, for instance. You're really questioning what you believe in or how you think things should be, either spiritually or psychologically or socially. You're really kind of challenging the beliefs that you had, and it's causing sort of like a, who am I and what do I want to do about this? And it's a crisis moment for yourself. So it could be a very internal sort of a process that happens here, and not even necessarily something that's happening overtly in the world that, with people and places that you experience. So this upheaval also will bring on or show some shadow aspects. So the tower's shadow aspects would include the flip side to all of what I was just discussing. So it could show that you are having a lack of insight. So if you're looking at your shadow aspect while you are developing, here, if you're looking at this as a point of enlightenment or insight, then the shadow aspect to that would be that you are lacking some insight in the position that you are in. And if you don't gain that insight, you may have this chaos that will come from what you are doing. So it may be sort of like a way to sort of to look at where you're at in the situation and say, am I really looking at this from an enlightened perspective? Another shadow aspect to this card could be that you haven't shed things as you go along in life and that you are holding on to your old ways. Because remember in the beginning, I told you that this was a card of letting go and releasing. It may also show in your shadow aspect that you are reluctant or avoidant to change some of your ways. So those are some of my key points, I think, the elements that I bring across when I'm reading the tarot and these three cards come up. So they're grouped together as the dark side. They're the cards that perhaps people might think of as very scary. Interestingly, there are entire decks that are made now to show all of the cards in the tarot, and they kind of make them all look scary, or they might make them all look quite flowery. However, the original Rider-Waite Tarot is kind of a system that I really appreciate. And whether I'm looking at more modern decks or the more traditional sort of versions of the deck, the symbolism, whether I see it on the card or not, the symbolism of these original cards is what I think of. And I think they make for very useful readings. Okay. I hope you did enjoy this. Please do like and subscribe, and make some comments to let me know if you have any questions. And if you would like to have a reading, I'm going to leave my contact information down below. There it is. Onward and upward. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.